Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Great to be back with y'all. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host for the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel and is a good libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, great to be back with y'all. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org for 3 decades worth of principled articles on the libertarian philosophy. All right, Richard, we're reaching near the end of our series on socialism. And I thought that what we ought to do this week is to just summarize and analyze and examine where we are here in the United States today. We've examined the principles of a socialist system, the variations of socialism. We've talked about how this philosophy got introduced into American life, how it came about in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, how it evolved with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And then we talked about the warfare state side of this thing, the national security state side. And so here we are today in 2020 with really a gigantic socialist system consisting of a giant welfare state system where the government has essentially nationalized people's income. The income that people make is really subject to control by the federal government. I mean, sometimes they're good to us and they don't tax us as much. Sometimes they're not so good to us and they take more. But there should be no pretensions about who's in control of people's income. That's the government. And as compared to a system where the people are free of any possibility of income tax. But that engine of income taxation is really the primary engine that funds this gigantic welfare state and this gigantic warfare state, along with the Federal Reserve, which of course prints the money essentially to finance the excess amount that they're spending, that is in excess of the tax revenues which they borrow, and then they use the Federal Reserve to debase the currency and destroy people's income and savings that way. So one of the big problems we face in society, it seems to me, is that so many Americans believe that this is freedom. I mean, you hear it in just regular conversations, in the mainstream press, op-eds, editorials, that America has a capitalist system, a free enterprise system. And of course, I think they're comparing it to other countries where the amount of the welfare state, the socialism is oftentimes so much greater than it is in the United States. But they look at this gigantic welfare state system and the managed, regulated economy as free enterprise, which is so nonsensical because even the term free enterprise means enterprise that is free of government control and interference. I think that if the American people were ever to discover that this is just all indoctrination, it's propaganda, that a massive welfare state system where the government's primary job is to take money by force through the Internal Revenue Service from people to whom it rightfully belongs and give it to people to whom it does not belong, I think there might be a chance for a free society, because at least people would then know that this is not freedom, it's not free enterprise, it's the exact opposite. And the same thing with all of this foreign military adventurism, and you've got this massive socialist edifice, the military-industrial complex. Milton Friedman pointed that out many years ago when he said that the military is your grand example of a socialist structure, central planning, hierarchical structure, and so forth, and is proven to be so destructive, not only to the people in the Middle East and Afghanistan and other parts of the world, especially like with the drug war that they're waging in Latin America, But it's proven to be destructive of our liberties and rights here at home, because they generate the terrorist threat through their interventionism, and then they use that threat to have this massive bureaucracy called the NSA to conduct secret surveillance, the CIA, with dark, sordid powers of assassination, including over Americans, torture, indefinite detention. So you've got the massive warfare state socialism and the massive welfare state socialism that we're living under, that is often perceived as a free society. And I look at it as, screws that are constantly tightening on the American people, not to mention programs like the drug war, which of course tighten the screws even more. It's really the destruction of American freedom, American privacy, under the guise of freedom. So, where we are today, it's not a pretty scene. It's pretty dark scene with respect to liberty. But there's one bright light shining through this darkness, and that's libertarianism and the libertarian movement. I mean, if it weren't for libertarians, think how bad things would really be. It would be like everybody's living this life of serfdom, believing it's free. I mean, then where would we be? So libertarians and libertarianism and the principles and ideals that we bring, I think are extinguishing this darkness. The more that we grow as a movement and the more dynamic we continue to be, the better chance that this darkness will be extinguished, and we bring about a monumental shift toward economic liberty, principles of freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. What do you think?
Well, I just reiterate or reinforce some points you made. One of the most important ones, it seems to me, is how many of our fellow citizens view the system they live under as basically fundamentally all right. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't political debates and disputes and arguments among our fellow Americans. We particularly see it in a year that is an election year, that the parties are divided, the people argue over what the other side is doing or insisting upon what they would promise to do. And as a consequence of this, there seems to be these divisions and arguments and differences of opinion. But when you look beneath the surface of it all, what you see is what you were emphasizing. And that is that we've reached a point in our country where, for all intents and purposes, the American population presumes that the system that they live under is a system of freedom that has imperfections that just need improvement. And in general, what kind of improvements do they see for that America? More of the same. Let's think about those on the political left in general. They say America has too much unrestricted control. People aren't taken care of with their health care sufficiently. People have uncertainties about their retirement. People have uncertainties about their jobs and about the wage that they earn. And so you have a group of people in our society who are insisting upon an expansion of this socialist direction, as you correctly pointed out, even further, more intensely, more comprehensively. But then there are supposedly their critics who have the same views. They just see that government needs to be more overarching and controlling, regulating, intruding, but just in different ways. But the underlying premise is what the socialist state is always about, and that is political paternalism. The presumption that individuals do not have the knowledge, wisdom, or ability to manage direct control and decide their own destinies, either concerning their own very narrow personal affairs or in their interactions with others. They need a guiding hand. They need an overseer. The epitome of this was during Barack Obama's administration, when maybe some of the viewers and listeners remember, one of the government agencies, one of the welfare agencies, put up a cartoon video called The Life of Julia. And Julia was this young woman who was basically taken care of by the state from the moment she was born. She was born with government health insurance support. Then she goes to school, government school. And her mother has a government-funded or subsidized daycare center for her to stay in while the mother is working, with the sort of implicit assumption it's a single mother. Then she goes to college, and Julia gets there because, well, she's a woman and she's need some type of affirmative action support to see that her admission is treated fairly and justly. And the tuition clearly is partly or totally funded by the government. And then Julia goes out into the labor or working market. And again, the state has to see that she's not discriminated against. And then she goes through her career, and then it reaches retirement. And Julia is taken care of by Social Security until her final days. Now, to be honest, when I first saw this, it's so over the top that I thought at first it was a parody by a critic of the then administration. But then I saw who had it on their website, and this is not a parody. This is how these people view us, whether it be in this case a woman or a man, a young girl, a young boy. The presumption is you need a daddy state to take care of you, to use that phrase that came from Bismarck's Germany when they established their welfare state, literally from cradle to grave. The idea that the individual should be self-supporting, self-regulating, self-choosing, self-responsible, that the individual should take these decisions on their own and develop a sense of adultness to think both about the present and the future in how they decide and design and direct their lives and budget the money that they have. This is totally undermined by this. You are to be kept permanently as an adolescent, a child. You're infantilized. That is, you are made a permanent infant, where this daddy state is to care for you, taking you by the hand through one stage of your life until its end, carrying you. Now, this unfortunately has become increasingly embedded implicitly, either in its full form or partial forms, in too many of the minds and psychologies and attitudes of our fellow Americans. I think that earlier in our welfare state series, I had mentioned, and if I can just sort of reiterate it, the British, beginning with Queen Elizabeth I, had their version of a welfare state called the Poor Laws. And since the Church of England is a government institution, taxes to support it would be siphoned or filtered through from those who were taxed through the Church of England as the dispenser of it in the parishes. And when the system came under investigation for reform in the 19th century, what was found was that you had intergenerational dependency upon the state. There'd be children, parents, and grandparents. All three generations were on these forms of that British version of welfare dependency. The classical economist Henry Fawcett, who wrote a book about pauperism on this theme, pointed out that if you spoke with these people in these investigations, they viewed that they had an entitlement to this, and that receiving these government redistributions was as a legitimate source of income and financial support as having a regular job and earning your way by serving others in the marketplace through free and self-interested exchange. And furthermore, there was this tendency that we've seen in America of broken families, because the British state of that time would allocate more support money for unwed mothers. And the more children they had out of wedlock, the larger the allotments they would receive. So as Fawcett points out, what kind of perverse incentives does that create? Well, to not get married and have a lot of kids, particularly since the mother received a larger monthly allotment than a married woman who maybe her husband had died. Now, if you think about it, that is variations of those themes that was seen by the classical liberal critics and reformers of the British 19th century system is what we see today. Only this has been broadened. not just in the narrow sense of a welfare check. You have an entitlement to your government subsidy and farm support as someone in the farming industry. You have a right to your subsidy to support your business as in electric powered cars. You have a right to a subsidy to have the solar panels on your house. You have a right to a subsidy for the government to supply and maybe forgive your college tuitions that you've accumulated, your debt. The state has a responsibility to cover your retirement, your medical expenses, to supply your housing, to guarantee you a job, to assure you a wage. What aspect, what corner, what little nook and cranny of our society, of our lives in our society today are not in one way, shape, or form now overseen, managed, regulated, controlled, commanded, prohibited, or directed by government? There's none. And it's presumed that government has to regulate industry, determine the means of production, the methods of production, the work conditions, the management behavior towards the employees, and the employees having certain guaranteed safety nets below which they need not worry. All of this is a situation in which this is the system under which we now operate. Now, the difficulty we have, and it's important to be honest in these things, Jacob. This has been embedded so much and for so long in the mentality of the American people for several generations now. It began, one could say, with the Wilson administration, with progressivism, certainly with the Roosevelt administration, with the New Deal of the 1930s, but certainly it has been reinforced and getting more penetrated in people's thinking in the post-war period, and especially since the Great Society programs of the 1960s. And particularly since those who support these programs and have this paternalistic attitude dominate the political arena, have wide sway over education from elementary school through the college and university experience, and certainly the media is on the bandwagon that it is always the market that is failing and the state that has to care for people. It is without a doubt an uphill battle. But merely because it is an uphill battle does not mean that it has to persist and fully run its course to a full societal disaster, though that could be the end of the road. What we have to do is that you were saying, we have to follow the avenues and methods and ways we can to successfully share these views and values with our fellow citizens in conversation, in dinner table exchanges, lunch conversations with our fellow workers and our family members. If you have a chance to write an opinion piece, if you have a chance to just write something for a newspaper, if you just have, most importantly, I would say, practice what you preach if you believe in these freedom principles. When people see that you don't agree with these ideas or don't feel comfortable with these ideas, do not be afraid, and in fact have the courage and integrity to explain why not. If those who believe in freedom are not willing to take up the cause of challenging the premises upon which the existing system exists, then it is absolutely certain they're going to win, in the sense the path that we're on will be followed. But if it is challenged, it can be stopped and reversed. Every seemingly unending trend that has eventually changed course has done so because some small group of people, an intellectual minority, has questioned and challenged and spoken up against it. And what seemed like lonely voices at first finally has a momentum that as the trends that they're challenging, as they're becoming worse, pick up more and more people who listen to them and take them seriously. All of the great changes in history for the better have been on that basis. And we can do so again. But it requires, in the face of a lot of countervailing forces against the freedom idea, to be willing to go against the tide.
Yeah, I mean, you take great concepts like due process of law and habeas corpus and freedom of religion and freedom of the press. These are all freedom of speech. These are all ideas that started with a very small minority of people that were committed and that would not compromise their principles, that ultimately end up attracting a larger group of people and then a larger group of people, and suddenly that giant shift takes place in society, at least in certain societies, where these ideals are engrafted into law and custom and tradition. Your principle of the paternalistic state is a very good one. I think there's so many Americans that look at the government, the federal government, and to a certain extent the state governments, as their daddy. That daddy's there to take care of them, and even worse, a God, where their God's taking care of them and watching over them and making sure they have a safety net in case they fall off the high wire. And in the process, it has damaged people's faith and freedom. I mean, a classic example of this is the crown jewel of the welfare state, Social Security. I mean, why is it that the government has to force young people by taking their money and giving it to seniors? Well, the implicit notion of this is that younger people cannot be trusted to take care of their parents and their grandparents or others on a voluntary basis. I mean, if you have faith in a free people to do that, to step up to the plate and help parents and grandparents and the elderly and seniors and others on a voluntary basis, well, if you have that faith, then you sit there and say, we don't need anybody to be forced to do this. We don't need government to do this. But the fact that there is this program has damaged that faith. The assumption is, oh no, if we freed up the American people and abolished Social Security, the elderly would be dying in the streets because you couldn't count on their children and their grandchildren and church groups and neighborhood groups to come to their assistance. And that's a horrendous aspect of the welfare state. Another aspect of it is this concept that these welfare state programs reflect how charitable the American people are. I mean, that's just nonsense. Charity and force are opposites. And the welfare state is based on force. You've got the Internal Revenue Service that goes out and audits people, and if you don't pay your taxes, we all know what the Justice Department's going to do to you. They're going to come after you, target you, put you in jail. If you resist, they'll meet your resistance with force. And there's nothing voluntary about the payment of Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes and income taxes and so forth. You don't pay. They come after you. They target you with incarceration and fine. Well, how is that reconcilable with genuine charity? Charity is when it comes out of the voluntary heart of the individual. So these welfare state programs are actually the opposite of charity. If I come and accost you in a dark alley, Richard, and I tell people that you're going to if I come and accost you and say, give me your money or I'll kill you, and then I go take your money and give it to the poor or some elderly, a person that needs an operation, am I a good and caring person? Are you a good and caring person for participating in this process? Of course not. This is just stealing, and obviously they would come after me. They'd prosecute me, and people would support the prosecution, and rightly so. I'm just a common thief. But when the government does it, it's no different in principle. It's morally wrong to take money from a person to whom it belongs and give it to another person, regardless of what the motivations are. And if you take something like Medicare, I mean, what's fascinating is these people that say that argue that, oh, well, yes, Medicare and Medicaid have resulted and produced this giant healthcare crisis. But all that we need to do is expand the socialism to resolve the crisis. I mean, that's not even logical. If a socialist system has produced a crisis, which it has in healthcare, the solution is not more socialism. The solution is to pull out the socialism by its root. Or to use a medical analogy, when there's a cancerous tumor on the body politic, you're best off doing everything you can to get rid of that cancerous tumor. And that cancerous tumor is Medicare and Medicaid. That's the reason, the root cause of the soaring healthcare costs. We had the finest healthcare system in history in this country before Medicare and Medicaid. Healthcare costs were low. They were stable. Hardly anyone even had major medical insurance because prices were so low and stable. Along comes Medicare and Medicaid, and that's what destroyed the system. That's where you got this huge ever-growing, perpetual healthcare crisis? Well, the solution is obvious. Get rid of the cause of the problem. But the problem is that mindset again. Oh no, we're too dependent on this political healthcare narcotic. If we were to abolish it, people would be dying in the streets. And there's also that damage that's been done to the idea of a voluntary society where doctors and hospitals would be providing free healthcare or greatly discounted healthcare to the poor. People have just lost sight of that. And yet that's what we need to recapture, Richard. We need to recapture faith in ourselves, faith in others, faith in freedom, for me, faith in God, and get rid of this notion as the government for people's daddy or people's God.
Yeah, we need to remember, and it's a theme we're going to talk about next week, that is how such a free society would handle many of these problems. An understanding from the past that has been lost and a vision about what the future could do better. But let us keep in mind that when this country was founded, and for a good part of its history, the government didn't do these things. Things were offered by the market for pay for services rendered in these social areas of life, or they were done through charitable organizations sponsored by church affiliations, or they were just private associations that were formed for philanthropic purposes by people in communities who saw the common concerns and interests that if they jointly and voluntarily did not take them on their shoulders, these problems that were of matters of concern to them would not be handled. They didn't turn to the state. They didn't rely upon the state. They didn't consider the state as the appropriate venue for the solution of these social and community problems. That understanding, that attitude, that default position, if you will, has been lost. I remember in the 1990s when there was a reform introduced to limit the number of months that people on welfare could receive their monthly installments. In other words, there were work requirements. And it was said that with the state no longer guaranteeing perpetual welfare provision, that the elements of the private sector would have to again take responsibility for this. Several associations of churches spoke out vocally against this, saying, this is not our responsibility. We can't handle these private charities. I mean, the historical perversity of this is that it was often considered faith-based organizations in the earlier parts of American history that were naturally the ones that would bring together members of a community, usually of that denomination or faith, but sometimes interfaith associations, to handle these problems that required help for the needy, those who had fallen upon hard times, those who had either temporary or even permanent dependency because of physical ailments or the loss of a breadwinner and the need to support children, or an orphan, for instance. This was all expected to be done by communities, and often these church and faith-based organizations. Now enter the 1990s, the end of the 20th century, and they're raising their hands in shock. What do you mean? We're supposed to do this. We're supposed to get our parishioners to donate money to help the needy? My God, that's what government is for. Well, when churches take that attitude of all organizations, regardless of the faith or the denomination, this explains how far we have followed a path different than the one upon which the country was founded.
Yeah, your point about the power of ideas is so good too. I mean, here's what's so strange about this thing. As you point out, we've essentially had two different systems in American history. So you have this system that we'll talk about more next week, but where people are free essentially to keep everything they earn. There was no income tax, no IRS, and free to do whatever they wanted with their own money, including donate it or hoarding it or saving it or whatever. So you have this system with no mandatory charity, no Social Security, no Medicare, farm subsidies, corporate bailouts, foreign aid to dictators for more than 100 years. And then along come a generation of Americans, maybe 6 or 7 generations after the founding of the United States, that say, we want a new system. We want a different system. It really wasn't new. It's the system that has gone on throughout history, but one where the government's the daddy, government's the provider. Well, if they could pull off this gigantic sea change in American life through the power of their socialist ideas, because it was like a siren song, like a narcotic. The government's going to take care of you. You don't have to worry anymore about the vicissitudes of life. There's going to be retirement guaranteed for you. There's going to be health care guaranteed for you. Well, if bad ideas can cause such a gigantic transformation of life, so can good ideas. And those are the sound ideas that we'll be talking about, that we've been advancing for 30 years here at FFF, and then we'll be talking about next week. But it goes to show that if bad ideas can transform a society, so can good ideas. And so it's imperative that we continue doing that we advance those good ideas until we attract enough people that brings that major transformation that brought things like freedom of religion, freedom of the press, due process of law, and all of these great achievements on liberty.
Well, the important thing, as you're saying, is that the transformation of a set of ideas. We have to ask ourselves and throw ourselves to share it with our neighbors. What does it mean to be a free human being? Is it to be dependent upon others, and most especially upon the government? Or does it mean to be self-responsible and self-motivating and self-taken care of, with the realization that we, as John Donne said in his famous poem, "No man is an island." Of course, we live interdependently with others in social arenas of many types. And we are in an environment in which sometimes we need the assistance of others, and sometimes others need our assistance. We do a lot of this through the interactions of the marketplace. As Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, every exchange comes to, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. And terms of the bargain are set. But there are instances beyond that narrow sense of market supply and demand where we are interdependent and need each other's mutual assistance. The question is, is it morally right to place these matters in the hands of government? And is it just pragmatically most efficacious to do so, rather than to leave these in the arena of voluntary association, the institutions of free civil society, so that we can not only bandy together and develop the character of a mutual sense of benevolence, but also to leave a latitude of competitive openness to find the best avenues to find the solutions to these social problems that concern our fellow man.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that even the socialists are dissatisfied with their own system. I mean, all we hear is, crises in healthcare and crises in immigration and crises in out-of-control spending and debt and the Federal Reserve and so forth. Well, all of these crises, inequalities of wealth, all of these crises are inherent to the system that they've put into place more than 100 years ago. I mean, they're inherent to their system. And so what I think another aspect of this that we'll be exploring next week is, what is the system that raises standards of living, especially for the poor? What are the causes of wealth? And then, even more important, what is the system where it brings real meaning to people's life? Under what system can a person best fulfill his potential, and to find meaning in life, to find his particular role in society? And I would suggest that it's a genuinely free system, not one where the government is serving as the paternalistic daddy or the warfare state warrior stomping on people around the world. So we're out of time, Richard. On that note, greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and look forward to wrapping up this series with you next week.
Until next time.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in again. And again, if this is your first exposure to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got a free FFF daily newsletter. We've got a monthly journal that costs $25 a year or $15 for the digital version. And if you like our work, we would very much appreciate your financial support. Until next week, Richard.
Until then.